thank you for tuning on in here. And in this podcast, we're just going to be touching on something we kind of covered it in the last one briefly, but I would just like to talk about an alternate history of if the Ukraine war went a different direction from the outset, and let me just explain how that could have happened. Trump campaigned on global peace in the last election, and it appears he's making it a big staple of this one. Now that, and by far, since Biden took over the office, global instability has been on the rise, and peace has been a far-flung concept for many on the global stage. And so we have disruptions like this in Ukraine we see right now, with the spiraling escalation as they strike into Russian territory. And so how could this have been different in an alternate world if Trump had been elected on the grounds of peace like he was going to be, or like he was campaigning? Well, it's just ironic that all we've had is war ever since, and I'd like to just delve into this a bit and flesh out how a strongman, and that's what a lot of people like to call Trump a strongman, but how someone that instills strength through security could have changed the global dynamic on terms of foreign policy. And Trump makes no qualms about this. He says that he could have prevented just about everything that's gone awry these days. And to be honest, it was a pretty peaceful time during the Trump administration. So there is some credence, I suppose, in terms of his track record of global peace and peace in the Middle East. But we saw with the botched withdrawals and everything that's happened since Biden took over, it's really just been global chaos, one way or another, whether this is a direct correlation or not. I believe that Vladimir Putin may have invaded Ukraine still if Trump was president. He would have been much more intimidated about the American response, and he wouldn't be grandstanding as much now about nuclear weapons. In a way, our abstinence at the beginning of the war actually plays into Putin's current boldness, thinking that he can get away with just about whatever he wants inside of Ukraine, although there is stiff resistance still, and many lives have been lost, thousands daily, and this is just an unfortunate reality of the current situation, a failed debacle. And let me just explain exactly how things could have been different, because I would like to clarify, I don't think it's really been discussed as much. But I believe at the outside of the war, America had a profound opportunity. If Trump was still president, he would have called Putin's bluff. And the second they sent troops and tanks into Ukraine, we would have just supplied Ukraine with all the weapons we've been supplying them with now that took years for us to deliver. But now we're sending much more in terms of armaments to Ukraine than we ever would have if we'd just given them what they needed to defend their homeland from the outset of the war. If we'd just given them what they needed when they first asked and passed a bill through Congress that would have given them the aid that they needed then, such as fighter jets, which was a steeply controversial topic at the time, though Western provided F-16s would take a significant amount of time to train pilots in Ukraine on, so we really should have been thinking more seriously about this from the outset, considering the goofy world we live in now. Everything's being given that we were debating months ago, and we've really just been playing catch up with Putin at this point, because we could have given all this months ago and actually made a difference in the war, but we're not going to turn the tide now because he's had months of warning, and when we send F-16s now, or F-14s, Putin just targets them and eliminates them as a threat. So we really, and I can't emphasize this enough, we shot ourselves in the foot in a way in terms of precedence and initiative of the United States Armed Forces. We should have dispelled Putin from any further conflict from the outset, and I believe a strong leader would have done this, and I'm not going to speak as though I'm the president, but if we had just given them all these things at the start instead of debating it and allowing the war to continue until now, when we're giving much more than we ever would have needed than what would have been required at the outset of the war, now we just give about everything we can pass through Congress. We give millions in aid, and we give whatever military hardware or war machines or equipment we can find conscionable enough, and about everything goes these days. Even surface-to-surface missiles are being provided. These would have made a major difference in the outset of the war when Ukraine still had the majority of its territory, though now it's been such a trailing escalation, it really may not make much of a difference in the outcome of this war. Though the grind of attrition has continued, it really only feeds and serves to prolong the war and current conflict in Ukraine, and doesn't really aid the situation as much as it would have if we just provided what they needed earlier. But we've taken so long meddling around and worrying about what would be acceptable when Putin sits there and says that he finds it acceptable to use tactical nukes and to wipe out the battlefield with nuclear weapons. So obviously Putin doesn't have any cards off the table. He's all cards on the table, and he's willing to use whatever means in his disposal. It makes the US and NATO look weak that we're not willing to do the same, although nukes is an obvious escalation. I believe Putin wouldn't be talking about nukes right now or discussing such things if we had a stronger presence of deterrence, and we showed that maybe we could counter things in a conventional way in Ukraine without having to bring up the nuclear debate. We obviously have nukes to match Russia, so this really wouldn't help anyone if we ended the world over a foreign conflict. Obviously, many Americans are conflicted on the war in Ukraine, as the tax dollars we've spent there have obviously steeped, and the war seems to continue to drag on with no change in sight. So really, all we're going to have to do now, we're basically stuck there in Ukraine, not with troops on the ground, but financially. We have to keep giving them money to fund the war effort, just so it drags on and continues the war and loss of life. This is going to continue. All it serves to do now at this point, with everyone so firmly entrenched in their positions, it's just dragging the war on. And I wouldn't say it's worth it to deter Putin in the future, because he's already not been deterred. So this is just a greater loss of life for really no reason, because after the war, one way or another, he's going to do something else and attack another country regardless. Biden is somewhat of a hypocrite for funding this war for so long. I find it's also ridiculous and weak of Biden in terms of capitulating to the anti-Jewish hatred that has prevented him from using our tax dollars to fund an ally in the region, our only ally in the region. This is the same man that was giving millions to Iran and hoping for peace with them, while they attack Israel, and many others do as well, and funding a brutal and bloody war that continues for many, many years. We don't have the slightest choice on where our tax dollars are actually spent.
Thank you all for watching. Patreon link will be in the description.